I made the decision, I needed to make the decision that I was going to experience what it felt like to die consciously. Even though I know there is really no death, it is simply moving from one state of being to a higher state of being or a higher state of consciousness. I knew that in order for me to release myself from a fear that had held me since I was a child, I needed to experience consciously allowing myself to transition, allowing myself to go through the motions, the feeling, the very real experience of transitioning, and allowing myself to face the fear. My name is Melanie Stewart, and I am your host on this podcast, Beyond Gaia. I welcome you with my heart, and I thank you for being present for episode 2. Episode 2, which I haven't put a title on yet. I could call it Rebirth, but it feels so much more than a rebirth. But let me share more with you. I thank you very much for choosing to be here with me. And please know that I share today with you with an open heart and with transparency, with the intention that this may support another through their challenges and experiences. Before I get started, I ask that you close your eyes as I close my eyes and I place my hand on my heart, and I'm just going to be clear with my intentions within this Beyond Gaia podcast. I call upon the Creator of all that is, angelic beings and great beings of light, individually our higher self and our oversoul, our spirit guides, our astral guides, any benevolent future counterparts that wish to join us in this transmission. We thank you for your presence. We thank you for your love and your guidance and your support. Thank you for the beautiful reflection that you share with us so we are able to see, know, and be more of ourselves. It is done, it is done, it is done, and so it is. May you also know that any beings that you are invoking or connecting with in this now are simply you connecting with more of yourself. Again, I welcome you to episode 2 of this podcast. Today I'm going to take you on a journey with me of actually what brought me to the decision and why I needed to experience transitioning, what it actually feels like to consciously die. Before I take you down that very vivid journey with me, I would like to share with you a little about what brought me to this decision. And that would be because since I was a child, and the earliest memory I have is myself just walking, standing beside the pram, holding on to the side of the pram, screaming in fear and pointing up at, it was a very high ceiling, but it was quite dark, and pointing up and screaming. Now, how I felt in that moment continued to stay with me up until fairly recently. Now, I'm going to go as far as saying that it stayed with me up until now, but it doesn't have the hold on me that it had up until very recently. So I had lived with this fear my entire life. I'm going to share a little bit about what the fear is, just enough to give you some insight, but there's also some of it that I just need to also keep personal for myself. However, if you've experienced anything like this, please feel free to comment or to send me a message, because I have felt that sharing is very important, is that we can actually share our challenges and the fears and the experiences that we've actually chosen to create for ourselves within this projection. It enables us to move through the density with more ease. The fear that I had was very unusual. I wouldn't call it agoraphobia, because it's not that. It was actually very different to that. But there were similarities in the sense that vast open skies, and especially at nighttime, sometimes during the day, but more so at nighttime, were hugely triggering for me. And I would go into a state almost instantly of panic. And I would come up out of my body, and I'd be able to see the version of myself that was there, that was panicking. And I always found myself making a decision as to how I could sort of come back into my body and ground and keep myself safe. Now, this vast, open, dark skies would actually present itself. It sort of had, that was sort of the main root of the fear. However, it had many branches on the tree. So sometimes I could be in large buildings with high ceilings at nighttime, like a stadium, or just, like I said, some type of large structure or building, and that in itself would be very triggering for me. If I was up somewhere high at nighttime, in a building, or going over a big bridge at nighttime and it was up quite high, that was also very triggering for me. I remember being quite young and being with a group of friends and going up in a high-rise building for the first time and being out on the balcony, and it was at nighttime and everybody else was sort of a little bit afraid and looking down over the balcony, going, feeling the fear and talking about it, and asking me whether I felt scared. And I said, no, I didn't feel scared to look down. That didn't bother me at all, even though we were up high. What frightened me was looking up. And they all found that really interesting. How could you be afraid to look up? It's so much more frightening to look down at the thought of being up high and falling. And I could never sort of quite understand it from a young age. However, the more that I actually came to know myself, the more work that I did on myself, the more that I awakened, the more conscious and self-aware and sentient that I actually became, the more this fear became clearer and clearer within my world, and I started to understand it more and more. I would go for large periods of time, being about 4 or 5 years between when I'd have a really strong episode and I'd have a breakthrough, and I'd have a break for 4 or 5 years where I could feel it, but it would be like a murmur in the background or a rumble in the background. And then it'd be sort of 4 or 5 years later, it would sort of cycle back into my life. It's very important to note that over the years, I have done intense, intricate work with myself in order to get to the heart, to the root of what this actually fear was. Being very present with the fear, listening to the fear and the different aspects of myself as to why they felt that way, what they were really afraid of. I learned to love it unconditionally, to embrace it, there is so much work over the years that I've actually done with this fear. I'd also visited I'd visited shamans, incredible channels and healers, and it was interesting that none of them were actually able to quite put their finger on what the heart of this fear was and where it had actually come from. They'd be able to assist me in releasing the energy, some of the energy around it, but nobody was able to truly assist me, and which to me rings home the importance of us actually truly knowing that if we are to really be able to move through any great challenges like this, we truly need to be able to face it ourselves. And I had felt that I'd actually faced it in so many ways. There are many moments where I did become frustrated with it because I, after a while, just learned to live with it having a grip on me. Now, the really strange paradox that's here is that whilst I had this fear of large open skies at night time, I am somebody that's always from a very young age actually been able to astral project. And I can leave my body and go up into the vast open sky with ease, almost at will. At will, I can sort of transport myself to almost any location, different dimensions when it's relevant for me. So there was this strange paradox of, whilst I was able to do that, when I was put in situations where I wasn't in an astral state, there was a feeling of being out of control and leaving my body. And that's what would happen. And it would especially happen when I would be driving at nighttime on big open highways or freeways and it's dark. And then out of nowhere, almost like in an instant, I would enter a state of panic. And this version of myself that's speaking to you now would almost take a back seat and I'd watch another version of me sort of completely spiral. And then I would be out of my body and I would be watching myself panicking, driving the car, looking down upon myself, and also realizing how dangerous that was and doing what I could to get back into my body and to keep myself safe. So that's just some of it that I'm sharing with you. There is more detail there, but I do actually want to share that there was many different branches to this tree that I actually looked at where I'd been, sucked out of a craft and sort of just died in open space. I'd been thrown out of a plane and had accidents there. I'd had really high ceilings that had sort of fallen on me. And there's lots of sort of timelines that I sort of went into in a lot of detail to actually understand why there were actually very real parts of me that were actually still feeling very unsafe. And I also managed to associate that this fear that I was feeling was mostly related to earth trauma, because when I go up into the astral, I am mostly detached from the earth and I don't feel any actual sense of fear or trauma there whatsoever. If there was off earth trauma, I would feel it when I was actually in an astral state. So largely the majority of this trauma has actually come from earth-based incarnations. Please excuse me if I'm jumping around a little bit, because there's a lot of content here and I'm doing my best that I can condense it for you and keep it streamlined without going on too much about the same things. There is one thing that's very important here that I want to share with you before I actually start to go into the process of how I chose to transition consciously, is that I am somebody right from a young age that was born into trauma. I was born into trauma. I grew up in a lot of trauma. I then went and married into trauma, because when your wounds are unhealed and that becomes all that you actually know, you then, well, when I say marry, it was never official with a certificate, but through this men's culture, I did marry into trauma. And then that was so traumatic. When I left, it became even though I was freeing myself from the trauma, there was another side of trauma that came about when I had to leave the marriage in itself. So I realized that I had also, living as a sole parent and raising 2 children and choosing to run your own business and follow your excitement, there were sort of secondary traumas that were associated with that as well, because there was a sense of, for a long time, it hasn't been like this for a while, but there was a sense of survival for a long time. And I realized that I had learned to normalize trauma in my life. I didn't really know how to live without a level of trauma in my life because it had become so familiar, and that I felt quite confident and almost accomplished in the fact that I could overcome any trauma. I'd faced so much, there wasn't anything that I couldn't overcome. And whilst there is a level of that being healthy and being very resourceful, there's also a level of that that's very unhealthy. So what I chose to do in a different way to what I've actually done before I experienced the transitioning, is I chose to, in my diary, go back and actually to every memory that I have, major memory and trigger in relation to trauma, that I was actually going to go back and I'd journal a little of it. I'd write down the date and the time that I would begin my journal. And then through an astral projection, I would actually take myself back and revisit the trauma. Revisit that version of myself, whether she was on an alternate timeline, the one that had actually had the traumatic experience in the plane, whether it is my child self, whether it was my maiden self. I was actually going back to these timelines through the astral projections, and I was visiting them. But I was visiting them, the only way to do this is if you're very much centered in your heart space and feeling a lot of joy and a lot of peace, and your sovereignty is the place that you actually choose to go back and visit these versions of yourself. And when I would do so, I would also place these versions of myself in these beautiful golden orbs of light, so that they weren't, I was protecting them from feeling any more trauma while I was resolving what was there. So I went back, like being on a mountain and choosing to climb down the mountain to every little spot that was difficult for you, every little spot that was difficult for me. And I did that, and I still haven't completed it wholly, but I've worked through a lot of it. And it truly makes me feel emotional in the best possible way, because it just brought levels of bliss and truly feeling a sense of peace in my heart, seeing those versions of myself knowing resolve, knowing what it feels like to feel peace, knowing what it feels like to feel safe. Safety was a very big thing for a lot of these different aspects of myself. And knowing that we are our own greatest healer and guide in that way is truly seeing yourself in a very different light. So I am still continuing to do this, but I've been doing this for months now, and it's not every day. It's something that you go to when you actually feel as if you're ready. And I've been keeping a journal of that. And because even though this wasn't the seed of my fear, it was still very much feeding this fear that I had, because from my youngest age, Earth wasn't a safe place for me. It was something that was very unsafe and very traumatic. And the sky, in one way, I was actually looking at as being where I was going to, that I was going to die, because I have experienced a lot of sort of near deaths, so that I was going to die. And I don't feel the need to go into the details of how I come to that conclusion. But that's one way that I was actually looking at, unconsciously, actually looking at the sky and sort of the greater abyss and sort of where I was going to. Now, what is strange, or it's not strange, it's a beautiful paradox, is that, again, this version of me has never felt afraid of death. I just haven't. So I was quite surprised to actually discover these aspects of myself that truly did feel so unsafe and was afraid of that transitioning. So it was within an astral projection state that I discovered when I was going to very deep parts of myself that I touched on and spoke about in episode 1, that I came across a crystal skull and there was a serpent snake there, and it became clear to me through the message that this skull gave me that the only way I would truly free myself from this is if I allowed myself to consciously experience what those parts of me were the most afraid of, but to do so in a conscious astral state gave them a level of experiencing this and feeling this and living this, but in a very safe way. Because it isn't the end of my life path, but I got to experience what it would feel like if it was the end of my life path. I also related some of the fear that I was actually experiencing to the divine feminine, that there are parts of me that aspects of myself that were feeling, there were eons and eons old. If we were to go back to the beginning when Source first chose to experience itself and in order to do so there needed to be a level of separation into the feminine and the masculine, and that there were choices therefore made by the feminine and the masculine, where the feminine chose to actually experience the darkness and forgetting who she is, forgetting actually what love is, and allowing that sense of, that very real feeling of contraction and going into the dark, into the void, and that the masculine actually chose to experience the light and remembering who they are. And so there were aspects there of that dark void, aspects of myself that were still very fearful of that space, that dark, expansive void. And when you're dealing with aspects of yourself that are so ancient, so very, very, very old, even though everything is in the now, one of the worst possible things that we could actually do when we were going back to those parts of ourselves is actually ask those aspects to let go, because they don't have any comprehension of what it would feel like to experience letting go. That would only imprint them further within the darkness. So whilst you and yourself can actually experience the letting go and being the guide in that way that leads by example as to what it feels like to experience surrender and letting go, those other parts truly have no comprehension, no awareness of even the concept of letting go. So there is a fine line there to walk and to be very self-aware that when you are going to those aspects of self, that you lead in those moments by example and be very conscious of the fact that they're in a very different level of density and do not have the same level of understanding or consciousness that you do. I would also like to speak to the ego death and how this is very much what was also happening with me at the same time, and a reason why it kept cycling back. Even though I've been through an ego death before, this time it actually felt very different, a lot more intense, even though the last time I experienced it, which was about 5 years ago, felt like the most intense experience that I'd ever had. And it went on for about 7 days. Back then I actually experienced an intense, very intense ego death experience. This time, this has been lasting with me for nearly 6 months. And again, I actually knew through the guidance I received from the crystal skull, from the cells of my own being, that I needed to allow myself to experience this so I could feel a sense of being free from this. So I could actually allow those different aspects and versions of myself right at a cellular level to have this experience. So the journaling and leading up to this was very important, so that I was actually integrating levels of trauma and that I was feeling more able to support myself. I chose to do so. I set the date for the full moon in Sagittarius. I knew that it needed to be under the light and the support of the full moon. The full moon prior was a full moon that was an eclipse in Scorpio, and that wasn't an energy that I actually wished to wield moving forward, remembering that when you have a transitioning experience like this, you are being born again. And so therefore the date and under what full moon and what energy was very important to me. My North Node is in Sagittarius. I saw the symbol of Sagittarius, and that golden bow was reaching right back is what I actually felt like I've been doing my entire life with the arrow. Is I kept drawing that arrow so far back into the darkness, and then I would let go, and it would always shoot me further and further each time. But this time I was actually doing it differently. I was shooting that arrow right up into the source of my own being. So I set the date for the full moon in Sagittarius, and I could feel the energy and the momentum leading up to this, and I didn't feel any fear at all in the lead up to it. I actually felt a level of excitement, curiosity, and also there was a part of me that just became very neutral with it. It's because I knew in such a visceral way that it's what I needed to do. As I sat down on my bed that evening on that full moon, I had my journal with me because it was important to me that I journaled the date and the time, because when I come out of this, I was going to sort of cast my astrology chart when I finished, to actually see, knowing that that would imprint me, that would be an important part of my personal blueprint moving forward as to the astrology of the evening. And even as I closed my eyes and began to go into the astral state, I felt an immediate sense of being deeply connected and engaged. And what I mean by that is I always feel like being engaged or locked into place. And locked isn't the right word necessarily, because that feels like a sense of restriction. But if I was to use the reference of a key going into the lock, and just when it clicks, it opens and everything just aligns. I have that feeling when I go into an astral. I feel, and that connection firstly comes from when I'm in place with my higher self. I can feel us both engaged, my higher self and I both engaged. And then I feel it with many other beings that I actually work with, many other counterparts. When they engage with me in that way, I feel it like a pillar of light that's coming down through the center of my being, and their pillar of light, and the two become one. I felt this on this evening, but like I hadn't experienced before. It was so strong, and so I could feel the energy coursing through my veins. It was very, very intense, but intense in a very secure way of feeling safe. I knew that the energy was big and I could feel it. I could also feel a lot of energy around me, a lot of different beings around me. And in those moments, I sat there before I went up into the astral, feeling an immense sense of appreciation and gratitude for the support that was around me as I actually chose to have this experience. As I started the astral projection, I knew that I had to take myself astrally first to allow the fear that I have in the moments of panic to come to full fruition. So what I actually did is I actually astral projected myself to driving a car on an open road at nighttime, and allowing and remembering it isn't always triggering. It's just as triggering for me when it cycles back every 4 or 5 years. I'm in the astral projection, I'm sitting in a car and I'm driving at nighttime. I can see the full moon in the sky above me. And I allow that panic that comes in when I am triggered to actually I surrender completely to the fear and the panic. And the panic and the fear becomes me. And I actually allow the worst case scenario to unfold. So I actually run off the road, down an embankment, and I actually hit a tree, a very big tree. Now, whilst this was happening, I remember coming out of my body before I hit the tree. And when I say out of my body, I'm already in the astral projection, so I am actually already experiencing being out of body. And I actually experience coming out of my body and beginning to transition just before I hit the tree, just before that moment of impact. And as I do, I'm actually hovering above the car, and I start moving quite quickly where I can still see the car, but I'm not as close to the car. And then I have enough awareness in that moment where I'm pausing and allowing myself to actually take in what's just happened. And I momentarily, I want to highlight this because it doesn't last very long, but momentarily I actually feel sadness. And the sadness is more so for my children. I feel sadness for my children. I feel the sadness of, and this is where there is still that slight lower mental body that's still slightly involved. And it's important that I experience it in a way that could be the worst case scenario. I'm not trying to elevate my astral experience so that I'm just having a great time dying. I'm actually allowing myself to go through emotions that are very real and could be very real for those denser aspects of myself that are fearing this. So I have enough awareness for me to allow myself to actually experience some of the things where a more and heightened version of myself may not experience it transitioning. And I'm hoping this is making sense. So I'm pausing enough to feel the sadness for my children. I feel a sense of sadness of this cycle, of this life, of it being done, and levels of start flashing over me of regret and different things that have actually occurred in my life, but it's all happening very quickly, but it's only momentarily. And then the frame shifts from there, and the next experience I'm having is that I am shooting up. I'm already out of the Earth's atmosphere, and I'm actually shooting up through the cosmos. I'm shooting through the stars, and I am almost like a beam of light myself. I'm almost like this comet or this shooting star, and I'm just soaring through the sky. Feels like I'm moving at the speed of light, and there is this immense feeling of freedom, of absolute bliss, absolute joy, nothing in those moments mattered. Nothing. There wasn't even a thought of what might matter. And I was traveling in, absolutely flying through the cosmos and through the stars. And then the next thing, the frame changes and I seem to come to a stop, and I am in the middle of the cosmos now. Our changes, and I'm in this space that is very, very pale pink, white, and I can also see shimmers of, just very faint shimmers of gold. And that's just this expanse that is around me. As I'm saying this to you now, I can actually feel myself there. There's a part of me there now as I'm sharing this with you. And it's very, very serene. And I'm looking around, but not with my eyes, because there's also this level of awareness that I am this space at the same time. So that I don't feel a beginning or an end to myself, but I am taking it all in, not quite knowing why I was there, but not needing to know why I was just in this space all of a sudden. And then what happens next is that I feel, before I see anything, this enormous presence. And I recognize the frequency, the energy straight away, and that it is, and the energy feels very masculine to me. And straight away I can see with my inner eye, with my inner being. And when you astral project a lot, you get to sort of see in different ways that are beyond our eyes. I see what at first looks like a very large serpent, but white, this very large white glowing serpent. And then as I focus on this energy more, I can actually see that it's, rather than it being a serpent, it's this large, powerful white dragon that is in front of me. And when I say in front of me, whilst it is in front of me, it also feels like it's everywhere at the same time. I'm experiencing what, if it was to take slight shape and form, what it would look like, but I'm also experiencing this pink and white energy and gold energy that I'm seeing, as if that is also the dragon at the same time. It's a little hard to express this because it's not of this world. It's not of a language that of words that we actually use. And this dragon has this enormous presence. And then it begins to speak to me, and the sound, the vibration that I actually feel in my being is this very deep voice and this deeply masculine energy. And to this now, I still cannot remember exactly word for word what was said, but I'm going to paraphrase slightly, and you'll still understand, and I hope that you'll feel the energy of what exchanged. The first thing that was actually said to me is, this dragon asked me how I was feeling. And I remember feeling quite surprised, but pleasantly, that was the first thing that was actually asked, is how I was feeling. And I responded saying that I felt nothing and everything at the same time. Because I did feel nothing, I just felt myself as this expansive nothingness. But yet at the same time, I felt these feelings of all these higher feeling emotions that were elation and joy and bliss, and almost quite sort of, in a very different way, quite orgasmic I just felt this incredible amount of love. And again, that just sense of release and feeling freedom. And he didn't respond to that. He almost sort of just acknowledged my response. And then he asked me how I now felt being in this current experience, how I now felt about fear. And I responded in quite a humorous way that I felt that there is nothing to be fearful of. There is purely nothing to be fearful of. I didn't feel not even a grain of sand of fear whatsoever. And from there, this dragon, in a very cryptic and also mysterious way, helped me truly feel and know in ways that I could actually take back to that version of myself that was still sitting on the bed holding this astral projection in place, that there's never anything to be fearful of. That feeling that I was having in those moments, allowing that to permeate my being, and that this energy needs to expel to all the different places within the cells of my being, within my projection, so that it was felt and remembered and known, so I could actually choose to actually live knowing that there was nothing to ever be fearful of. And the words that I'm actually using at the moment can barely do any justice to what the actual experience was, to actually be immersed in a place of this incredible nothingness, yet you are everything, that there is nothing to fear, it did feel like a place of enlightenment. It truly did. From there, this is when I actually knew that I actually had to go back to my body and take this experience with me, remember this experience, share this experience with others, because it's very profound when you can actually choose to experience it in this way consciously, that there wasn't any medicine that was taken for me to get there, that I realized that I was the medicine that I was actually needing, and that astral projection can allow us to actually enter these altered states of being where we can experience more of ourselves. It's actually quite natural for us to do so. We're just in the process of remembering. And that's what I hope to do by sharing the stories in this podcast, is that you actually remember something that's actually quite natural to you within your own human being, within your light being, having this projection. Before I actually chose to come back to my body, I had this moment where I got close to the dragon, and I was almost went up just underneath the dragon, what I would consider to be sort of the bottom of its neck, where there was this big sort of rounded sort of belly, and allowed myself to truly sort of embrace this version of me, because whatever I was experiencing in this projection, I actually understand as being a reflection of more of myself. What any of us experience within any of this projection, let alone an astral projection, is simply more of ourselves. So I allowed myself to truly feel, and when I embrace this being, and I, not so much from an arm's embrace, it was this me feeling as if there was no beginning or end to me, and just allowing that energy to come up underneath this dragon. And I did so from that space, more so out of respect. And then there was this blending that happened of our energies that I knew that was an important part of this truly being felt and staying with me, imprinting me in the best possible way. there was in this experience that I went on to have where I could sort of see this tunnel or beams of like a gold light above me. And I just allowed myself to become, it just happened very organically. So it's not thinking it through at the time. It was just following through with the pulses of energy that are inviting you in the moment. I became sort of this vortex of energy that just sort of spiraled up into this gold. I know that gold is very much revitalizing and strengthening and purification, and I felt all of those things in those moments. I really did. I just felt more of myself, those dormant parts of myself that had lived with this fear for a very long time, that had started to allow their world to become smaller and smaller through the fear of stepping outside of the boundaries that the fear had created. So I could really feel those parts of myself in those moments, even if they didn't understand what was happening. They could feel what it would feel like to release. They began to understand that what it feels like to be without the limitation. They began to remember that there is no separation. That these parts that have been what feels like suppressed and then living in this compression come to know separation. They come to believe that separation is true. So they actually felt, I could actually feel them having these moments of realization and clarity around knowing that there is no separation. And for me, again, being able in this now, in those moments, to be in a very real way a future self, a future guide for those other parts of me, as well as for this version of me, is very empowering. It's very empowering for our own being. It's a big sigh that I managed to get through that and share that with you. I came back into my body and it took a few minutes, probably longer, before I could even sort of open my eyes. I did feel a very different version of myself. I wrote down the time afterwards. I sort of looked up the astrology and the details, and it all very much resonates with this new version of me that I'm still integrating. It's been 2 weeks to the day since this had actually happened, and there's still a lot of this that I'm integrating. What is paramount for me to actually share with you is that this process that I've actually utilized isn't a one fix wonder. It isn't like a light switch that all of a sudden turns on and what was there previously is no longer there in the light of a new day. It is important that, yes, this very real death that I experienced and this rebirth shifts me and will continue to shift me to a timeline where I'm not living with the trauma, where I'm not living with the fear, and I'm living with a very integrated version of myself that hasn't actually had those experiences. I would describe where I am now as being about a midpoint, or just past the midpoint, between that version of me that was sitting on the bed about to have the astral experiences as a conscious death, and the version of me that's feeling very integrated, and that I don't have any of those experiences within my awareness any longer. I'm about just past midpoint. So I'm on a timeline at the moment where I'm feeling much more integrated. I'm feeling a lot more resolve. I'm feeling like I can be much more myself. I feel as if the confines aren't there. I feel a lot more at peace with this process of just allowing that the fear can just now be. But I still know that I've got a way to go. So it isn't a one fix wonder, but what it will do is hugely catapult you to a timeline where you are living your heart's desires in a way that are a lot more integrated, where you can be much more of yourself. So I'm on my way. And the reason why we need to be on our way, because it is, as cliche as what this sounds, it is about the journey. It is actually about the experiences. Transformation on this level is a process, and it is so very, very important for our being that we actually honour the process and allow the cycle of transformation to take place without there a need for things to be right or to fix them, but just allowing the process to unfold. And that's very much what I've been doing. So I am feeling a very different version of myself. I'm still getting to know this new version of me as I continue to shift. And mostly, I am full of appreciation to have this level of awareness, to be able to explore and know more of myself, to know the parts of myself that have felt unsafe and insecure and traumatized and wounded in so many ways, that I am able to truly have them join me on this journey. Like the hand's been stretched out, and now in their own perfect time, they're choosing to join me. And as I spoke to you before about saying that I had to make my way back down the mountain to all those different parts of myself, that I've blessed and that I've held and that I've protected and that I've integrated what's there, they're choosing to join me now on this journey of making our way back up the mountain. And at this point of where I am now, I don't know what if there's much more to life truly than us actually truly knowing ourselves in these ways, and that we're never really there and knowing ourselves. It's each day I know nothing. Each day I wake up as a student, and that I am continually learning, and I am blown away by just when you think you get there and you get close to knowing more of who you are. It feels as if you're back at the beginning of the spiral again, and you're on this whole new discovery and exploration as to knowing more of who you truly are. Know that we are blessed with so much support, our astral guides, our spirit guides, many different beings that support us, that are physical and non-physical, galactic beings. We are blessed with the levels of support that we actually have to live out this projection. Because remember, what you're experiencing, what I'm experiencing, is there's nobody else out there. It's just you and you. It's just me and me. And so the more that we lean into actually living that as much as we can, especially when it comes to healing, especially when it comes to bringing resolve, it does bring about much higher levels of consciousness. It does truly allow you to see yourself as a conscious creator of your world. So on this day, on this new moon, my heart thanks you sincerely if you've chose to hang in with me for this long. I truly appreciate you being part of this channel. If you care to like and subscribe, I thank you very much for your support. I wish to remind you that I have a Patreon channel. It's a new Patreon channel, and is it even a channel? I don't know what it is, but it's a new Patreon membership, and the link will be down below for you to come over and actually have a look at the offerings I have on Patreon. I teach and share all that I've learned about astral projection, my healing, life experiences, creating, channeling. I share with you as much as I can, and I'm there to support as we actually create a community together of living as multidimensional beings in this way. So I invite you to come over and have a look at my channel, please. You can join in membership for as little as $20 a month. Now that $20 is AU, so US dollars, it's about 15, somewhere around there. So I've made it very affordable, but there's a lot of content. I've only had that channel open for 2 weeks, and I've already put up a couple of hours worth of teachings. I will be running a full moon guided astral immersion on this next upcoming full moon, which will be in Capricorn. So I will place details of that on my social media page, and if you are a Patreon member, you actually get to join in the guided astral immersions as part of your membership. So again, thank you so very much for being here. I'm still working on an outro. I'm new at this podcast, so for now I'm just going to send to you my and our unconditional love. Bye for now.